So this is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza. And right now we're in no man's land.
Everyone recognises that in the end there will have to be a negotiated solution to this conflict. But it's for the Ukrainians.
With the Ukrainians declaring, having driven everyone out of their country. Okay, so you're in the room. Would you offer more money than the government is offering?
There's going to have to be compromise. It's not just about pay.
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things, and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And may say all your examples.
My name's Andy Bell, and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, we bring context and understanding to a big story in the news by talking to people with real insight. This week, has Rishi Sunak done what his three predecessors could not, pulled off a deal with the EU, which could also win the approval of the Conservative Party? In the past, the love-in between Dear Rishi and Ursula von der Leyen would have been enough to infuriate Tory MPs. But right now, it doesn't feel that way. So, is the Windsor Framework made of durable timber? How does it work? What are the hidden problems? And will it last? I've been talking to a man who knows all about negotiating with the EU. Raoul Ruparel was Theresa May's special advisor on Brexit. He's now working with BCG, the Boston Consulting Group. So, Raoul Ruparel, when you saw the deal, the Windsor Framework, what was your first reaction to it?
My first reaction was actually quite surprised that they'd managed to secure some of the things they have managed to secure, in particular around the Stormont break and the scope and breadth of that. But also, I think some meaningful changes on both customs and agri-food approaches to the border. I think they have meaningfully got the kind of channels approach where you have a red and green channel for stuff going into Northern Ireland or the EU. And I think they've also achieved a number of things that the EU previously rejected. We have grace periods that allow parcels and pets and things to move freely, and the EU has previously resisted putting those into a permanent footing, and those have all been done. So, yeah, generally I was quite surprised on the upside.
So, has Rishi Sunak, has he fixed it? This problem that's bedeviled everyone since, certainly since at least sort of 2017. Has he fixed it?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on the DUP and the stance they take. Ultimately, fixing it means getting executive back up and running and having sustainable politics as much as you can in Northern Ireland. It's not just down to the protocol, of course, but it's a big part of that. And look, I think he's done very well and better than people expected, and he's given it a great chance. But obviously the DUP are still making, difficult sounds. It's not clear if they will go back into the executive. And if they don't, the question is, where do you go next? Because I don't think there's any more in the negotiation, really. Maybe there's some things that can be done domestically to help them or make them feel more secure. But I think, beyond that, it's not entirely clear. And, then we're probably looking at fresh elections in Northern Ireland. And even then, if they're not going to form an executive anytime soon, where does it go? So, look, he's given it a really good effort. And I think he's made a meaningful difference to where we were. I'm not sure it's going to be the solution. We'll see what the DUP do.
Can I jump in there? What do you think? We have an idea, but you spell out as somebody who knows all this very well. What do you think are the real residual problems as far as the DUP are concerned with this deal?
Well, so there's a couple of issues here. There are legitimate concerns about exactly how the Stormont break operates. Obviously they would like Stormont to have more control, but the challenge is the UK has to operate for Northern Ireland in the international arena, so you can never really fully give it an international law to Stormont, and that is a challenge. I think there are also questions they have around how things will work in practice and the amount of data businesses have to gather on customs and agri-food regulations and things like that. So, legitimate questions on the detail. But there is a separate issue, which is, do the DUP ever want to go into an executive where Sinn Féin can be First Minister? Do they really want to reform the executive? So I think that goes beyond the protocol. So, it may be that actually the substantive problems or issues that they see with the protocol are not really the issue, and it's some of this other stuff. And I do feel there's been an element of goalpost moving by the DUP. We had those 7 tests, and it's a very high bar to set. And, we can argue about whether the deal meets all of those. But now what we're hearing from some of them, Sammy Wilson and others, is, well, we can't have any EU law in Northern Ireland. And that wasn't in the test, and that's quite a different proposition. So,
yeah, just to come in there, basically, am I right in saying there has to be some EU law applicable in Northern Ireland otherwise there's a hard border on the island. Is that it?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think if you want that kind of seamless access to the EU, then you're going to have to accept there are some laws and some rules. And I think the deal has narrowed the scope of that, and obviously it's taken quite a lot of them out of the green channel, so they don't apply for GB to NI trade. But yeah, it's impossible to get away from there being some. I mean, that's foundational to the nature of the protocol, to the nature of the setup. And
so is that a barrier that is impossible to get over, really? If there's people like Sammy Wilson, the DUP MP, are seriously saying that, that's never going to be fixed, right?
Yeah, I don't think that will ever be fixed. And you know, as you say, the alternative is really, the only way to fix it is to move towards having the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic along there, and trying to, and DUP would say, well, you can make that border as soft as possible, etc., etc. But we've been there, and you know that has a whole host of problems in itself. So I just don't ever see either side wanting to go down that route.
So the DUP may have their own agenda in terms of not wanting to get power sharing back up and running. In terms of the other group that has caused so much trouble, and that you probably have the old nightmare about dating back, the ERG, the European Research Group, it looks as if, and we are still waiting for the definitive word, but they seem largely satisfied as well. What would you identify as areas where they would be concerned that their so-called star chamber of lawyers will be looking through?
Well, I think it will be similar to the areas around that I mentioned for the DUP, you know, how this actually looks in the legal text, and do they think it's as binding as it needs to be and enforceable as it needs to be. They will obviously look at the role for the European Court of Justice. I think there isn't much in the deal that specifically addresses that directly. What it does do is obviously, as I said before, reduce the scope of EU law, and therefore the role for the ECJ shrinks as the scope of EU law shrinks. It's less present. But I think they would probably have wanted to see something directly addressing the ECJ point. So I expect they will pick up on that. Yeah, so they will look at those areas. And as you say, they take quite a legalistic approach to this, or their view of legalistic, shall we say. I've been around many circles with them, as you say, as well, on that sort of stuff. But yeah, to be fair, so far the reaction has been, you know, more positive than I expected. And, you know, obviously it's a slightly different situation now. You have a number of the ERG former leaders in government, Steve Baker, Suella, Braverman. So, you know, that has changed the context. And clearly I think there is a desire amongst the rest of the party to try and get this sorted, or at least on a better footing, and move beyond it.
Why do you think the EU have moved in the way they have? Because they have moved. They have made quite a lot of concessions, and things that we were told a couple of years ago were impossible seem to have become possible. You've already referred to the idea of the grace periods becoming permanent, which when you were in number 10 wasn't possible. Why do you think they've moved?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, to be fair to them, they have been doing a lot more engagement and listening on the ground in Northern Ireland. You know, they have undertaken a massive sort of programme of listening to businesses, actually speaking more to the unionist community, and trying to understand their concerns and see what can be done about it. I'm not sure there was that much of that before. You know, I think often in this process, they've very much taken their lead from the Irish government and their position on Northern Ireland. And that is, you know, a very valid view, but it is only one view and one perspective. And I think this time around, we have seen a lot more of that. So I think that's helped. Look, and I think all of this is they've been on a journey, like a lot of people through this, about what can really work on the ground in Northern Ireland. And as you say, it's very different from where they were back in Theresa May's time and even in Boris's time. And, you know, if you look at the paper they published in 2021 and some of the proposals, they were sort of tinkering on the edges of this stuff. But now they have made some meaningful changes. So I think it's really being exposed to this stuff on the ground in Northern Ireland and seeing that, you know, it's sort of, if they grip even tighter, sort of the sand slips through their fingers. Like, it's not always just about, we just need to enforce this more. I think they've realised, actually, if you want something that kind of works and is sustainable, you need to give a bit of flex.
Do you look at this deal and cast your mind back to 2017, 2018, 2019 and think, guys, why couldn't you have offered this to us? I mean, was that ever a possibility? Or you know, first of all, do you feel like that? Is there a bit of you that's a bit frustrated and think, come on, you know, why couldn't this have been possible?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I do feel frustrated at how long it's taken them to show this kind of flexibility and understanding of the unique and delicate situation in Northern Ireland. So it is frustrating. But that being said, as I said, I think they had to go on a journey. Look, we looked at all this stuff back in 2017, 2018. You know, the Channels idea is not new. It's something I think originated in Northern Ireland Civil Service, actually. I remember them writing the first paper on it when I was in government. And I was always quite attracted to this as a potential solution. I wrote about it after I left government in 2019. But the context wasn't there. And sometimes, ideas have their time and it probably wasn't the right time for it back then. And you also add to the fact that Theresa May had a very particular position that she didn't want any kind of customs border in the Irish Sea. And, while this does ease all of that, fundamentally the customs processes are still between GB and NI, not anywhere else. So I think everyone had to go on a bit of a journey to get here. So while I wish we could have achieved this earlier, and we did look at it, I think it's probably unlikely we ever could have done because people just weren't in the right frame of mind.
I mean, let's just have a quick detour back into history. I mean, Theresa May famously said that no British Prime Minister would accept a border in the Irish Sea. Boris Johnson then went on effectively to do that. But her idea, and when you were in government, was that the whole of the UK at that stage would be aligned with essentially European single market rules. I'm sort of slightly paraphrasing, but was that ever going to be acceptable to the EU? Because it clearly ended up not being acceptable to the Conservatives either. What was your memory of that?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously Theresa had her our Chequers approach, which was basically a single market in goods membership without free movement of people, but alignment of rules in that space, and then obviously this unique customs kind of arrangement, which we can set aside for a second. But fundamentally, I think the EU never really bought into that for a couple of reasons. One, they felt it was sort of the cherry picking. We remember all of those lectures and speeches by EU leaders about no cherry picking, etc. And just selectively choosing parts of the single market you liked and not having free movement of people, etc. But also I think they felt it wasn't in their commercial interest because obviously it gives the UK some advantages, in terms of being, continuing to be part of supply chains and manufacturing and that sort of stuff, which they sort of made a conscious choice they didn't want to happen when the UK was outside of the EU. So a combination of factors, I think they were never particularly keen on that kind of Chequers approach. And it's why you sort of see parts of what is attractive in Northern Ireland, you can never apply them writ large to the UK.
Well, that's interesting because following Rishi Sunak's speech, especially in Belfast, where he talked about how Northern Ireland had this amazing situation, part of the UK single market, part of the EU single market, lots of people were saying, have you noticed that? Well, thanks. Why can't the rest of us have it? I mean, just what would your response be to that sort of sentiment?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of really important points here. The first is, Sunak is talking about the best of both worlds. It has Northern Ireland has seamless access to both its biggest markets. So it's not just about the benefits of the single market; it's about having both of those markets. And so it's not, it's not directly comparable for the UK. I guess the closest comparison would be if the UK had seamless access to both the US and the EU market. So just saying the UK could be in a single market isn't the same. He's talking about that unique two-way facing benefits that Northern Ireland gets. And then when you talk about the benefits, it's also the terms that they come on. So Northern Ireland, because of its unique situation, yes, it accepts certain single market goods regulations, but it doesn't accept sort of inward free movement of people. People can't come and work and live there from other places in the EU as freely as they would if you were a member. They obviously have this Stormont break and some of the vetoes on new laws being added or expanded, which is, I think, unheard of really for any EU member state. They have vetoes on certain topics, taxation and such, but not on goods regulation. And so it's a very different proposition. So for those two reasons, it's not something that could ever be applied to the UK as a whole. So Sunak talking up Northern Ireland's place and its benefits, which I think he's entirely correct about, is not the same as saying, that means the UK should be in the single market or the UK should go for EU membership. Those are two very different things.
Okay, so let's assume that this sticks and we'll, the DUP and power sharing maybe will happen or it won't. But I think you're right. I think you said earlier, there's no going back and negotiating anything more with Brussels. I don't think anybody thinks that, and I don't think the government has any intention of doing that, even if the DUP say, this isn't good enough. So let's assume that stays, that the Windsor Framework. Is this the beginning of a new relationship between the UK and the EU?
It has the potential to be. Look, I think it clearly has improved the atmosphere and trust has been built between two sides that we haven't seen for a long time. For example, we've seen that they're beginning work on the Horizon research programme and the UK affiliation to that. So that's positive and a step in the right direction as well.
And that changed that overnight, virtually, because we pulled out of that or we'd been forced out of it, and now that's back on, is it?
And it's sort of quid pro quo. I mean, obviously they wanted Northern Ireland to be sorted, and that has unblocked a couple of things. That being said, I wouldn't get carried away about how transformative this can be. Yes, there are bits on the margin where you can improve the deal, but fundamentally, unless you start changing, membership of the single market, membership of the customs union, and therefore accepting, free movement of people and that whole debate, it's not going to make masses of economic difference from the current deal. So there are things on the margin you could aim for, and these are often things we've asked for before. I would also say in many cases, as I said, things were rejected not just for political reasons, but for commercial reasons. So one example is, we asked for the ability for, UK certifiers to certify to certain EU standards and conformity assessments, they're known as. And this is something the EU has agreed with other countries and is quite commonplace, but they refused to do that for the UK. And it wasn't because they didn't like our politics or they didn't like the Conservative politicians. It was because they just didn't think it was their commercial interest to have the UK outside the EU as a hub of these kind of certifications. Yep. So I think I'm sceptical that it will lead to a step change and really improving the deal, but it could improve the relationship in the atmosphere.
Yeah, so rather than a sort of leap forward in economic terms with a sort of expansion of trade or whatever, what about things like, I don't know, policing or environmental issues, or we mentioned Horizon as a science and cooperation, on those sorts of things on the margins, but it's still important. Could that improve?
Yeah, certainly it could improve cooperation, but I think even in some of those areas, I think particularly policing and crime justice, you very quickly get into issues of the European Court of Justice and free movement of people and all of that, so it does become difficult. I think in some of the softer areas, there's definitely, potential for improvement and cooperation. I mean, obviously, we know that, when the deal was struck and under the Boris Johnson government, there was no desire to have any kind of foreign policy structures, cooperation, that side of things. So, that if this government or any future government decides they want to change that, there is an opportunity for that. And the atmosphere is now in a better place for that as well. And obviously the context of the Ukraine war is another impetus behind that. So, yes, there are things that could be done around the edges.
What about small boats, for instance, or is that purely a bilateral issue, say, with the government in France and the government in the UK?
I think it's predominantly bilateral. I think it's very hard, obviously, to get into pan-EU issues in that sense without, again, talking about the free movement of people. I think, the Dublin regulations and the ability to return people to the first point of entry and stuff is kind of predicated on having a single market and free movement of people between countries. And so I don't think, the EU...
So we're out of the Dublin Convention.
Yeah, I don't see the EU ever wanting to consider involving the UK in that. But it might make a bilateral discussion slightly easier, but my recollection of dealing with the French approach on this was always they said, we have the kind of Brexit negotiations and the EU issue, and then we have our bilateral relationship, and they were always like, basically we are going to be honest, and it's going to be very difficult in the Brexit and EU negotiations, but actually we want to have a great bilateral negotiation and bilateral relationship. And so whether that's really feasible the way to do it, and I always thought the two do bleed across, but I'm not sure that really we'll see much more forthcoming from the French government on small boats because of this. I think it's more driven by their own domestic interests.
I mean, politically in the UK, it feels as if the Conservative Party's been on a bit of a journey. And I think that's a word you used. Obviously, we're expecting an election next year. Do you think the whole political kind of centre of gravity on relations with the EU is also changing, is moving?
Well, look, I think it is shifting a bit. You do see in the polls that people's attitudes are changing, but I think fundamentally, when you look at Labour's position, they still don't think it has shifted much. I think they're pretty clear in their mind that there's a certain group of voters in the Leave seats that they want to appeal to and they want to get back, and they don't see any value in trying to tap into whatever shift there might be yet. And I think that's going to remain true till the election. And I can totally understand their strategy from a political point of view, and it makes sense in the seats that they're targeting. We might see over time, once and if they get into office and they're more embedded and they feel more confident and the trend continues, then we might see actually a more desire to have that conversation. But I think at the moment it's not yet at the level where if Labour aren't being affected by it, then it's not really, I think, going to affect the key positions of either main party.
I know you've done some work on the survey of business confidence. Was that before, presumably, the Windsor Framework? I mean, what can you tell us about that in terms of the way businesses think about the UK, and I don't know if it's specific to Northern Ireland as well. What do they say?
Yeah, we did a survey of over 1,500 business leaders around the UK. It was before the Windsor Framework, but we did ask a few questions and around sort of business certainty and investment. And one thing we found that, what is the biggest holder or blocker of business investment, which we know is a long-term problem for the UK with underperformance in that space. And the highest ranking answer were from sort of 48% of leaders was uncertainty. And so obviously things like this with, the risk of particularly with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which has now been dropped, there was a fear that would be pushed through and could lead to trade retaliation and all this uncertainty hanging over. This does remove a source of uncertainty. I'm not going to say it's necessarily going to lead to a step change in investment, but I think everything helps on the margin and providing a bit of clarity. I think in Northern Ireland, what we found in particular was that, we asked how does the UK compare on a number of factors, and one of them was political certainty and stability. And in Northern Ireland, I think something like 75% of business leaders said the UK performed worse on political certainty and stability, which is not really something you'd expect of a country like the UK. And it just shows how difficult it's become in Northern Ireland. I think that's a combination of both the UK politics, but also the Northern Irish politics, lack of an executive. And it shows how difficult all of this has made life for business leaders in Northern Ireland, I think.
Okay, well, to sum up, we're coming to the end, Raoul. Do you feel confident, more confident than you did 2 weeks ago, perhaps, about the prospects for the UK and the prospects for relations with the EU now?
Yeah, I do feel more confident. I think the deal, as I said, has surprised on the upside and makes a meaningful change and will be positive for Northern Ireland and the businesses trading there if it can be implemented. I think it does put the DUP in a difficult position. If some of their aims have been met, and there clearly is an impetus within the business community and I think even within some of the unionist community to see a solution here. So let's see where they go. But I am slightly more confident. I'm not sure I'm yet at the stage where I think they will accept it, though.
Do you think we're all getting a little carried away, maybe, about this week? Because Rishi Sunak had a very good start to the week. I mean, would you caution with your experience a little bit of, hang on, everybody, just be a bit more realistic? Yeah,
I would always caution that. This process takes time to work out, and you can never underestimate the difficulties of politics in Northern Ireland. But, to be fair to Rishi Sunak and his team, I think the day after the deal was announced was probably the best day of headlines and news for any Prime Minister on Brexit ever. It was pretty much universal acclaim across the different media paradigms and sources. So, fair play to him, and they should take some credit for that. But equally, if fundamentally we don't get an executive back up and running, the question of what happens next and where do we go is still there. And my fear is that it starts to take us into even bigger questions around, well, if we're never going to get an executive back up and running, what does that mean for the constitutional settlement of Northern Ireland, which is a very difficult place to go.
Indeed, and probably something we should come back and talk about again. Raoul Ruparel, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Raoul Ruparel, with a note of caution about the Windsor Framework. How Did We Get Here is a Channel 5 podcast produced by Silvia Maresca. Thank you for listening to this episode. There'll be another along soon.